Hi everybody. Thanks so much for joining. Thanks especially Regina for joining us here today, and welcome to our second session of this year at Qualitative in our seminar series Hitchhiker's Guide to Epistemology, Theory and Methods. And today our session is on post-positivism. And specifically, we want to talk about how post-positivism relates to the method of process chasing, to doing fieldwork. And for that reason, we have invited Professor Regina Bateson, who's currently at the University of Ottawa in Canada. She is an assistant professor of public and international affairs there. Her research is motivated by the concern for the rights and dignity of ordinary people. And several of her projects look at how, when, and where vigilantism occurs. She studies also human rights, political violence, civil wars, political participation. For this session, we also circulated her piece on populism within Guatemala. So again, geographically, she focuses on Latin America and the United States, and is a real expert in those areas. She has extensive experience with qualitative methods. Just said now, you're also teaching it currently, so we're delighted to have you to talk about this. How the session will go in a way that Regina will give a short presentation, or she will give some comments on today's topic, and basically afterwards we open up the floor for everybody to ask questions, discuss their concerns, or maybe even their own research in relation to today's topic, so we can have a productive and informal discussion today in the session. Without further ado, I think I would give the floor to Regina now, and afterwards we'll have the Q&A. So Regina, please, and thanks again very much for joining.
All right, well, thank you so much, Wolfgang. Hi to everyone. It's really nice to meet you. And given that this is a small group, I'm really hoping we can have a back and forth discussion. So feel free to share your own field work and ask whatever questions that you might have about your own research too. So I have to admit that I was, on the one hand, I was extremely happy to get the invitation to join you here today. I suspected that Jeff might have some connection to this and might end up being here today. So I'm really delighted to see him. Obviously my first thought was Florence. Yes, of course I'll come see you. But even over Zoom, it's still really nice to get connected with people and not be so isolated right now. So I really appreciated the invitation. At the same time, I was a little surprised to be getting an invitation sort of to talk about epistemology or to talk about post-positivism, because it's not really something that I've actually written about. And, one of your questions to kind of motivate the discussion was about what comes first, method or excuse me, epistemology or empirics, and how it relates to your methodological choices in your research. And I have never consciously approached my career or my research with some sort of firm commitment to post-positivism. That was not where I started. And however, upon reflection and getting your invitation, I realized that this is really the basis of all or most of the research that I've done. And but I think that I arrived at that point on kind of a meandering journey, and very much sort of driven by my own experiences before graduate school and during graduate school, because I had, I guess, a fair amount of experience with what we might think of as field work before starting my PhD. And so it's always been kind of clear, it's always been clear to me that people see the world in different ways, and that colors the way that we see evidence. It colors the way that we design our projects, what we're researching, and I can't really explain where that came from for me, other than the fact that I had been in the Foreign Service of the United States, working for the U.S. State Department before doing my PhD. I had been in Guatemala for a year and a half in that role. I had done other kind of exchanges even as a younger person. So like high school exchange in Argentina, study abroad in university. I've had a whole bunch of different experiences and been in a lot of situations with people who have very different perspectives. And so I don't think I ever consciously became a post-positivist, but when I ran into kind of neopositivism in graduate school, it immediately did not make sense to me. And that was something that it was easier for me to kind of reject than it was it was more of a rejection, of that worldview than any sort of conscious embracing of another. But I think that over time I have come to more consciously embrace, many of the perspectives associated with post-positivism. And I see this in so many places. So in my work now, so something I was just teaching actually relates to the paper that you guys may have seen or read on Rios Montt. And I guess I'll ask at this point before I say anything else about it, and it's okay to be honest. Did you have a chance to read the paper? Because if you didn't, I'll say a little bit more about the project. If you did, I'll kind of like frame the comments differently. So if you happen to have read all or most of the paper, why don't you put your hand up? Or we could do it as an anonymous poll or something. If you didn't get a chance to, it's okay. But maybe you can use the hands up button or put your hand up or something like that, just so I have a sense of what people have seen of it. Okay, so it looks like some people have seen this paper and some people may have no idea what I'm talking about. So I'll tell you a little bit, I'll pause what I was saying about the teaching and the paper and the project, and I'll just tell you a little bit about this project that was circulated to you guys. So a number of years ago, I was invited to write a book chapter for an edited volume, and it was supposed to be about the FRG, which is the Guatemalan Republican Front, which was a political party that was founded, that operated in Guatemala in the 1990s, primarily, and then into the 2000s. And it was founded by Efrain and Rios Montt, who you guys are hopefully familiar with. He was the head of state in Guatemala during many of the worst episodes of the Civil War there, between 1982 and 1983. He then was overthrown in a coup in 1983. He was sort of out of politics for a number of years. And then as the Civil War was ending in Guatemala, and as Guatemala was transitioning to democracy, he got back into politics. And he founded the FRG. He kind of attempted to run for president multiple times. Polling suggested that he would have won if he had run. And I do believe that's probably true. And his party became very successful. So his party won the presidency, nearly won in 1995, and then won in 1999. And at the same time, Rios Montt himself had gotten himself elected to Congress, and he became the president of Congress, which is an extremely powerful position there. And a lot of people thought that when they took office, so I guess 2000 to 2004, arguably he was the most powerful person in Guatemala, even though he was the president of Congress. The president at the time from his party had kind of a subsidiary relationship to him. And so the bottom line is that Rios Montt re-entered politics during and after the transition to democracy and did very well, and won, tons of votes. And really puzzlingly, he did just as well in the areas that had been severely affected by the Civil War as in areas that had been less affected. And so, obviously there's some issues with ecological inference and connecting the dots, but from what we can tell, significant percentages of people who say that they were direct victims of wartime violence during the war, they voted for Rios Montt, at least according to what they said in surveys at the time. Indigenous Guatemalans voted for Rios Montt, as did non-Indigenous Guatemalans, as did a pretty wide swath of society. And so this is inherently puzzling to me. It's inherently puzzling to a lot of people, sort of how this happened. And, based on what we think we know about retrospective voting, voting for someone who literally tried to kill you is just inherently puzzling. And so the question is, how did he do this, right? That's the question that I eventually ended up doing some research on. But initially I got started on this project, just trying to write a book chapter about the FRG, his party. And so I ended up amassing all sorts of historical documents and working on this for quite a while. The chapter ultimately got rejected from the edited volume for which it was solicited, which is senior people, not a good move to do that to your junior colleagues. So then I was left with just mountains of information about the FRG and an absurdly detailed knowledge of Rios Montt and his political life and biography. And I didn't really know what to do with that. And so honestly, it sat in a drawer for actually a file on my computer for years. I worked on this other thing with Jeff, the socialization paper and special issue in the interim, did a number of other things, basically had most of my kids, ran for a public office, lost an election, came back to academia. So there were a lot of intervening events there. But then with fresh eyes, when I looked back at this in 2018, probably, I was like, I should just turn this into an article. Why is this still sitting on my computer? And so I had to figure out some way to kind of reframe it, and expanded the project somewhat and reorganized it quite a bit. And ultimately it was able to be a journal article. And it's kind of an unusual journal article. When I was working on it, I could hardly find any other examples of recently published articles that are single case studies that really are particularly focused on one individual. I mean, it's just very uncommon. And so at the time I was working on it, I really did have this feeling it was going to get rejected. I mean, I was kind of like, what do I do with this? Where do I send it? Writing an entire paper about one individual is very unusual. So I had to work hard figuring out how to reframe it, how to present Rios Montt as an example of something, and sort of tie it into some broader trends and events around the rest of the world today. I ended up having a section in the paper. If you take a look at it, there's a lengthy biography of Rios Montt at the beginning, which is also very uncommon in articles, to really have a lot of description. And interestingly, I did not get pushback about these things in the review process. So I say this just to encourage you that it might seem impossible to write a journal article about a single person or a single political party or a single episode. And in this case, it actually was fine. And I was quite surprised by that, quite surprised. I was fairly aggressive about trying to put in a good methods section from the beginning in the first drafts of the paper that I submitted for review, and give a lot of credit to Jeff and to others in the discipline that I think that there's more, it just feels to me like there's more of an acceptance of saying that you're going to do within case analysis of a particular case, and that there's just a lot more acceptance of process tracing as being methodologically rigorous work. And there's a lot more of a vocabulary to explain what it is that you're doing and how. So so it actually had a pretty straightforward review process with just substantive questions and things to add. And I added a bit more information about the role of Rios Montt's religious background, for example, because he was also an evangelical pastor, and that had a big influence in the way he presented himself. One of the other leading theories about how he did so well in politics was that it must have been evangelicals in Guatemala turning out to vote for him. There's kind of this sort of hypothesis that floats around in the literature that, Catholics didn't vote for him, but that the evangelicals did in droves. And doesn't really play out in the survey evidence that we have from the time period or in the qualitative materials. And there was actually a lot of conflict. When you look at it carefully, there was a lot of conflict between him and key evangelicals, and a lot of key evangelical actors in Guatemalan politics really distanced themselves from him. So it seems it's as these things always are when we look within the cases, it's really much more complicated than it seems. And so in the paper, I go through systematically these multiple different potential explanations, including what we might call an authoritarian inheritance. So the idea that ex-authoritarians are just kind of magically equipped with party organization, pre-existing sort of clientelistic relationships, a party brand, things like that from their authoritarian past. I discuss like the kind of the military mystique, the idea that ex-military figures just inherently have an advantage in situations of insecurity, because there was a lot of crime at the time. And so some people think, oh, it was his military image that made people vote for him. And in the within case analysis, it was really interesting to see how many other, I think I called them exauthoritarian wannabes there were, or political wannabes who were exauthoritarians also. But basically, when you really start looking, there are all these folks who kind of get missed if we just, if you look at data sets about like post-conflict political parties or ex-authoritarian political parties and things like that, you miss all the people who tried to start parties and failed. So often the FRG will be the only such party like listed for Guatemala in these kind of cross-national data sets or projects. And when you look carefully, there are, I think I found at least a dozen, somewhere, but it was, I'd have to look at the paper to check. It was somewhere between like 8 and 12 other pretty significant, ex-military figures, including another former head of state, including the person who devised the scorched earth strategy that Rios Montt then used. I mean, including people who were every bit as terrible in terms of their human rights record, and actually who had the same level of name recognition that Rios Montt did, except when they tried to form political parties and run for office in the 1990s, they failed. I mean, they just completely failed. Rios Montt was getting like 200,000 votes. They were getting, 5,000. I mean, it was not even close in terms of, there was not even a competition between them. And they used a lot of the same rhetoric. They used a lot of the same rhetoric of like, well, I'm an ex-military, I'm a military man, I can go fight the criminals. I mean, stuff like that. And yet it didn't really, it wasn't sufficient for them to enjoy the same level of success that Rios Montt did. So then the question to me is, so why? Why ultimately was he able to be so successful under these circumstances? And at this point might not be articulated as clearly in the paper, but my personal conclusion is that, and I say this cautiously because obviously he was a gross human rights violator and an individual that I have really no esteem or regard for. So let's say that very clearly. But having said that, my reading of the history at this point is that actually he's a very politically savvy individual. And I think that he was just more politically skilled than his opponents. And it was interesting for me, if we're getting back to the post-positivism, that when I came back to this project after being involved in politics myself, I saw things a little bit differently. So, I mean, having literally just run a campaign, when I looked back at some of Rios Montt's history and some of the skills that he appeared to have, and some of the presentational strategies and like charisma and the appeals that he would use with different groups of people. I mean, I really just saw someone who would be a skilled and formidable political opponent to anyone who crossed his path, really under almost any circumstances, whether, and it's interesting that to me, the 1974 presidential election in Guatemala ended up being really very revealing. And I talk about this a little bit in the paper. I wish I could have talked about it more. I think it's one of the most fascinating kind of episodes that I ran across in working on the paper. But in the early years of the Guatemalan Civil War, and before the really high levels of mass indiscriminate violence and genocide for which the war is known, before those things happened, in an earlier phase of the Civil War, when the country was still under military authoritarian government, basically, there were regular elections that were happening. It was just that the military would run their preferred candidate, and then that candidate would win over and over again, either generally through fraud. And so there was, however, a movement toward increased competition to some extent in the early 1970s in Guatemala. And there was always a political left in Guatemala. It was always active. A lot of those people were later killed by the government, but they were still alive in the early 1970s. And throughout Guatemala's tumultuous history, there have always been these moments of like kind of opening, and people think things are going to change now, and then they don't. And then they think things are going to change, and then they don't. And so the very early 1970s, like 1973 in particular, it was kind of a moment like that. And so there was a fair bit of leftist organizing, and the Christian Democrats decided that they were going to run a serious candidate, and they were really going to play in the 1974 presidential election there. Rios Montt had just been demoted from the chief of staff of the army, and he had been sort of sent into exile by the military. He'd been sent as military, I think it was military attaché in Washington, D.C. Or maybe it was another slightly different position in Washington, D.C. It might have been like liaison to the OAS. I can't remember his exact title at the moment, but he was in Washington, D.C. and had been sent there by the Guatemalan government to sort of get him out of the country after he was demoted from this position that had been extremely important to him in the military. So they approached him. So the Christian Democrats approached Rios Montt in Washington, D.C. And said, we want you to run for president for us. And ultimately, the Christian Democrats ended up forming a coalition. So he wasn't running as the Christian Democrat candidate. And he claimed that he never actually became a Christian Democrat per se. And I should also add, he was Catholic at the time. So he later became evangelical, but he was Catholic at the time. But he ultimately said yes, and he ran as their candidate. And he had a civilian leftist activist as his vice presidential candidate. I mean, that person was a kind of a serious activist, like had serious commitments to human rights, was later assassinated by the government to show you how strong those commitments were. And Rios Montt went back to Guatemala and ran as this leftist, essentially center-left candidate in that election in 1974. And his platform focused in part on human rights. So there were these posters and documents and things that I found from that time period where the military was accusing him of being communist. They were putting hammers and sickles on posters saying like Rios Montt, he's Leninist, he's this, he's that. He was I don't know that he ever got death threats. People associated with his campaign were getting threats. At one point, he became convinced that government snipers were trying to kill him. It was a pretty contentious situation. And as far as I can tell, all evidence suggests that the government saw it as a threat. And that was what the US government was reporting at the time, because I was able to get some of the cables and things from that time. And it was really interesting to get the CIA's assessment of what was happening at the time. I think I put this in the paper, but they called him a capable center-left leader. And, the assessment of the US government at the time was that his victory would, this is like a near direct quote, it's in the paper, that if he won, he would move the country, moderately but appreciably to the left. And it would be like a victory for human rights, that there would be improvements in terms of human rights if he were to win that 1974 election. He also had campaign materials that said, save your children from the clandestine cemeteries. That was verbatim from his appeal to people at the time. And he ran a national campaign. So he was out, in direct engagement with voters, very charismatic speaker, traveling all over the country. And all accounts that I've found of what happened next is that he won the election. So people thought and believed that he actually got the most votes. And then there was a delay. It appears that the government just changed the numbers and then changed things so that the military's preferred candidate won the election. And Rios Montt then ended up being the military attaché at the embassy in Spain for a period of time where he was just completely isolated and by all accounts miserable. And so he stayed there for a period of time. His vice presidential candidate was later assassinated. And then he went back to Guatemala in the very late 1970s, became evangelical, sort of fell in with his church. A whole series of events happened. And then he was later brought to power in this coup in 1982. And part of the reason the junior officers chose him was because of that campaign in 1974. So they saw him as this progressive reformer. And that was part of why he was tapped to be, to ultimately become part of this junta and become the head of state in 1982. So it's a bit of a long answer, but it's just to say that having come back to all that information after being more directly involved in politics, it really made me see him and his past differently. And, I could see just the amount of political experience and skills that he had under his belt. And I mean, he really had essentially run a successful national campaign before in Guatemala. And my assessment, ultimately, an argument in the paper, is that basically he was able to use those political skills and just that like political perceptiveness and savvy to realize that the moment was right for populism, and to have this like innate intuitive grasp of, you know, kind of how to become an authoritarian populist at a time when there weren't so many of them in the world. I mean, I later really came to see him as, looking back from the lens of today, you know, as sort of a figure on this leading edge of what we now think of as authoritarian populism, and someone who used a lot of the same language and tropes and strategies as, you know, like maybe, well, there are some similarities with someone like Bolsonaro, Duterte in the Philippines, and there's a whole range of people that we could point to today. And I think that, like, again, clarifying that I have no degree of esteem at all or respect for Rios Montt, if we acknowledge the political skills that he brought to the table in the 1990s, I think he was somehow able to perceive that and to sort of pursue this strategy when other people weren't in Guatemalan politics. And I think that was really critical to his success and his ability to found the FRG. So it's all to say that for me, that project, the evolution of it really highlighted that, you know, it is a fairly deductive project. It is hopefully rather organized and rather linear, you know, in terms of the process tracing, but at the same time, like sort of my own perspectives and my own changing perspectives over time really changed the way that I saw the project. You know, 2013 me would have written the paper differently, and in fact did write the paper differently than 2018 me. So that was very interesting, sort of as an experience for me. And I would also say that both in 2013, 2014, and later when I was working on the project again, you know, that my own experience working for the State Department really changes the way that I read cables also. And, you know, the Digital National Security Archive is a great resource that I used for this project, and I've used for other projects as well. But definitely sort of the way that I approach the documents, the way that I see the documents, you know, it has a difference. Things have a different resonance to me, because I think of, oh, that bureau or this bureau, or, oh, you know, I have some idea, like, what does the State Department consider a good cable? Like, is this a cable that would be written well by their standards? Is it strange in some way? I have a little bit of context for that. And so circling back to the teaching briefly, and I'll wrap up here and then take some questions and comments from you guys. Like, that's something that I was actually just teaching in my class. So, you know, I sent the students out to do their own research in the Digital National Security Archive, and to pull some primary source documents and analyze them and have us talk about them. And, you know, something I really emphasized to them was that we can be presented with the same historical document. And of course, we're all going to see something different in it. And there can be valid bases for many different interpretations of the same document. And in fact, it was quite interesting to me that they ended up pulling quite different documents, but in the assignment that they did, I could really see how their family backgrounds, their personal backgrounds and experiences, you know, influenced their analysis of those documents. Like, what they saw in the documents is not the same thing that I would have seen. It wasn't wrong. It was just, you know, a different perspective. You know, I mean, if someone's family is originally from Ethiopia, actually, I think the student was born in Ethiopia, and then they end up pulling documents about the CIA's, you know, covert missions in Ethiopia, for example. Of course, that person is going to have different knowledge, different context, a different perspective than I would if I read the same document. So for teaching purposes, I love doing exercises like that with my classes. Something else I'm going to do next week with them is I'm going to show them some little video clips of public events, and then I'm going to have them all take field notes on them. And I guarantee you everyone's field notes will turn out differently. I guarantee you. It always happens with every class I've ever done this with, you know, that we can look at the same event and come up with different but valid interpretations of it, and different but valid things that strike us as important and worthy of recording. So I, you know, try to be conscious of that in my work. And I think over time, I've kind of come to embrace that. Like, I've definitely come to see sort of political science as a more creative enterprise, and the fact that we all have our own style, we all have our own perspective. You know, I think it's a good thing. Like, the reason that you sit down to read a paper by Jeff, for example, is maybe it's the topic of the paper, but it's also because you want kind of like his unique perspective, right? Or his kind of unique mode of analysis. And at least that's the case for me when I sit down to read a paper. I think about, not just what is the topic of the paper, but kind of what's the perspective of the person writing it? What are the unique strengths that they bring to the table? And I think that that's a good thing. I think we should embrace that more. So in that spirit, I would love to turn things over to you and see if you have any specific questions, any comments. There's a lot else that I could address. Floor is open.